I still remember the exact moment I realized they'd gone too far. I was walking my dog along what I thought was my property line. The sun sinking low, casting these long, ominous shadows across the empty field. And there it was, 10 massive steel and glass towers, stretching higher than anything I'd ever seen, gleaming like they owned the sky. Only, they weren't supposed to be there. My land, my farmland. My quiet little sanctuary that had been in my family for generations. And somehow the HOA had built all of this, without me, without asking, without so much as a, "Hey, by the way, we're taking your land." I froze, my stomach twisting. How does something like this even happen? How does a handful of people, armed with contracts and signatures I never saw, just plop 10 skyscrapers on someone else's property and call it legal? For a second, I felt powerless, angry, outraged. I could almost hear the HOA's smug little laughs echoing across the concrete. But then, a strange calm washed over me. A voice in my head whispered, "They think they own it, but they don't know what's coming." I started taking photos, pacing back and forth, imagining every loophole, every clause, every trick that might turn the tables. I watched them bustling around, opening doors to offices I'd never step into, signing leases, laughing about another successful development. And that's when it hit me. If they were going to make money off my land, maybe it was time I learned how to make money off them. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew it wouldn't be quick. But something inside me lit up, a fire fueled by every injustice, every meeting where I was dismissed, every ridiculous HOA email full of threats I couldn't even legally enforce. And in that moment, I made a promise. I wasn't going to beg for my land back. I was going to flip the script. They built their empire thinking I was too small, too nice, too ordinary to fight back. But they had no idea the plan that was already taking shape in my mind. By the time they realized it, the tables wouldn't just turn. They'd spin so fast. They wouldn't even know what hit them. And the best part? I was going to do it while staying completely legal. The first few days, after spotting the skyscrapers, I did what any rational person would do. I called my lawyer. But as I sat there in his office, flipping through pages of zoning codes, easements and HOA agreements, it became painfully clear. This wasn't going to be a simple take them to court and win situation. The HOA had covered themselves with layers of paperwork, loopholes so tight they might as well have been steel beams. And yet every fiber of me screamed that they had overstepped. Started driving past the towers every morning. 10 monoliths of glass and steel, each reflecting the rising sun like it was mocking me. Office workers streamed in and out, coffee cups in hand, completely oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath their feet wasn't theirs. And the HOA board? They were like kings in a castle waving papers around, giving interviews about progress and community development, acting like nothing was wrong. One day, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I marched up to the construction manager, a guy named Brad who looked like he hadn't smiled since 2003. I asked him casually, well, as casually as you can when your life savings are under 10 skyscrapers. "Hey, do you know whose land this is?" He laughed. Not a chuckle. A full-on, dismissive buddy you don't even want to know. And that was it. No apology. No offer to discuss. Just smug confidence that they had already won. I went home that night and sat on my porch staring at the horizon where the towers glinted under the moonlight. I thought about every unfair rule, every hidden fee, every time the HOA had tried to bully the community into compliance. And then I realized they weren't just careless or arrogant, they were predictable. They had a formula. They thought control came from fear, from paperwork, from intimidation. And if that's their strategy, then I could play their game. Over the next few weeks, I started documenting everything. Property lines, lease agreements, permits, even aerial photos showing the exact footprint of the skyscrapers on my land. I learned the ins and outs of commercial zoning. I studied real estate law like my life depended on it, Because in a way, it did. Every day I imagined the moment when I could walk into one of those towers and flip the entire script, legally, and watch the same people who had laughed at me now scramble to keep up. And through it all, I kept my calm. I smiled. I nodded politely in HOA meetings. I played the good neighbor role perfectly. But inside, the plan was taking shape. Every document I studied, every loophole I found, every missed step by the HOA, they were all pieces of a puzzle. And by the time they finished construction, by the time they handed out the first office keys and rent contracts, I would be ready. Because they didn't realize one crucial fact. Building on my land didn't just give them office space. It gave me leverage, and leverage is power. By the time the last crane lifted its final beam into place, I was ready. On the outside, I was the same calm, friendly neighbor everyone assumed I was, smiling at board members, nodding politely during meetings, even complimenting the architects on their vision. But inside I was calculating every step, every signature, every loophole I could exploit. They thought I was powerless. They thought I would shrivel under their corporate arrogance. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The first thing I did was subtle. I hired a surveyor to map the exact boundaries of my property. Not just the old deeds or vague HOA maps, the precise GPS coordinates, the corners, the easements, every inch of land they had built. When the report came back, I felt a mix of shock and exhilaration. Every tower, every parking lot, every concrete slab that they claimed as development land was mine. Every square foot. Legally, undeniably mine. I didn't rush. That would have been a rookie mistake. I waited. I observed. I watched as the first tenants moved in, leasing office spaces, signing contracts, trusting that the HOA had done their homework. I listened to the hum of activity, the chatter of business meetings, the clatter of heels on marble floors, and I smiled, because each step they took on my property was like them handing me a ticket, an IOU that I intended to cash. Then came the first counter-move. I sent a polite, professional letter to the HOA. No threats, no anger, just facts, dates, maps, and clear evidence showing that the land beneath their towers legally belonged to me. The letter outlined my rights, my ownership, and carefully, deliberately, hinted at potential remedies. Rent, easements, shared revenue. I could almost hear their laughter through the envelope, imagining them thinking, "This guy doesn't know what he's up against." They didn't respond immediately. Instead, they held meetings behind closed doors, their voices rising and falling in frustration. I saw the subtle changes the next time. I attended a community event, board members avoiding eye contact, developers muttering in corners, a slight nervous edge creeping into the usually confident tone of the HOA president, and I knew I had them exactly where I wanted. The tension was palpable, and the first domino was about to fall. I also had my lawyer quietly draft a strategy, not for litigation yet, but for leverage. If they tried to bully me, threaten me, or delay the acknowledgement of my rights, I would be ready. Every document, every signed lease, every meeting note, they were building my case for me. By the time I made my next move, it wouldn't just be surprising, it would be inevitable. And that's when I realized the beauty of the plan. They had spent millions building these towers on land they didn't own. And now, every day they occupied the space, every tenant who signed a lease, every dollar that passed through their doors, was potential revenue for me. They had handed me the keys to a legal payday, without even realizing it. From that moment on, I wasn't just a landowner. I was a strategist, a quiet storm gathering strength. And the HOA, the developers, the smug architects, they were unknowingly fueling my comeback. The stage was set, the tension high, and the first move had been made. Just when I thought they might figure out I wasn't bluffing, the twist hit, and it hit hard. I had been quietly tracking every tenant, every lease, every payment flowing into those towers, and one evening while reviewing the files, I noticed something glaring, a massive oversight. A loophole so obvious that the HOA had completely ignored it in their haste to secure the property. One of the towers, Tower 7, the tallest and most profitable, had been built partially over a disputed easement, a strip of land that technically wasn't theirs, not in the HOAs, agreements not in any signed permits. Just a narrow margin, maybe 20 feet, but legally? Mine. And that meant, according to the zoning and property laws I had memorized by now, I could demand rent or access rights, or even partial control over operations. I almost laughed out loud in my living room. They thought they were untouchable, and all along, they had built their crown jewel on my terms. The next day, I did something daring. I scheduled a meeting with the HOA president and the main developer. No threats, no shouting, no theatrics, just calm, collected facts. I laid out the maps, the surveyor's report, and the evidence of the easement. The room went quiet, dead silent. Their eyes darted to each other. I could almost see the panic spreading like wildfire. And then came the line that would haunt them. I understand you've invested millions in these towers. That's fine, but every day you operate here, you're on my land, legally. And that means I get a share. Starting immediately. The silence stretched. One board member coughed nervously. The developer fiddled with his pen, and the HOA president, the person who had always prided themselves on control, finally spoke. We didn't realize. But I cut him off politely. You did. You just assumed I wouldn't notice. That assumption was your mistake. It was the first time I saw real fear in their eyes. Not anger, not indignation, fear. They knew this could spiral into a legal and financial nightmare. And fast. That was when I started negotiating, not aggressively, but strategically. I didn't want to destroy them. I wanted leverage, income, proof that even the smallest, quietest person could flip the system if they understood the rules better than those who thought they controlled them. Over the next few weeks, the tension skyrocketed. I began receiving calls from tenants asking questions about ownership and leases. Emails from nervous board members came in, desperately trying to clarify boundaries and rights every day. I felt the power shift. Tiny increments at first, then in leaps. By the time the first rent check from Tower 7 landed in my account, I knew I wasn't just winning, I was rewriting the rules. And the best part? They had built it themselves. Every crane, every architect, every signed permit. It all fed into my comeback story. They thought they were clever, untouchable. But all it took was patience, careful observation, and a willingness to play by the law. Better than they ever had. For the first time since they erected those towers, I slept without anger. Not because it was over, but because the game had changed. The hunters had become the hunted, and I was already several moves ahead. Once I realized I had them cornered, the next step was precision, careful, deliberate legal precision. This wasn't about revenge, this was about turning their arrogance into leverage. I didn't want to burn bridges, I wanted to make them pay, in the way only the law allows, and in a way that made their own oversight the reason for their loss. The first thing I did was formalize my claim. Every survey, every photograph, every lease I'd tracked, everything became evidence. My lawyer helped draft a notice of legal possession and an offer to negotiate rent for the areas of the towers that encroached on my land. I didn't demand anything outrageous, just fair compensation for the use of my property. And the moment the letters were sent, the shift began. Emails flew back and forth, the tone increasingly desperate. Board members who had once dismissed me as the quiet neighbor were now treading lightly, careful with every word. Developers who had strutted around like kings were suddenly calculating every move, every dollar, every contract. Every tenant in Tower 7, unknowingly, became part of my leverage. Every day they operated on my land without an agreement. Their financial exposure increased, and I hadn't even moved a finger beyond sending the letters and documentation. Then came the first rent negotiations. I remember sitting across the table from the HOA president, a man who had always looked down on me, now sweating as he signed documents agreeing to pay monthly rent for the land beneath. Tower 7. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply confirmed the terms and let him feel the quiet weight of inevitability. He realized that this wasn't optional. I wasn't bluffing. I had the law, the facts, and the patience on my side. Over the next few weeks, I replicated the same strategy for the other towers. Carefully, methodically, I approached each lease and each section of land. Always polite, always professional, always legally airtight. Every agreement that came in, every check that cleared, every acknowledgement from tenants or the HOA, it was proof that my approach worked. They had built on my land, and now they were paying for the privilege. The feeling was surreal. They had thought they were untouchable because they had money, influence, and legal teams. But all along, the simplest things, the actual property lines, proper permits, and a little patience, had been my greatest weapon. They had built an empire on my land, and I had flipped it into a consistent income stream. Every day I woke up and looked out at the towers, not with anger but with quiet satisfaction. They were operating under my rules now. By the end of that month, I wasn't just a landowner. I was a landlord, a strategist, a force that the HOA and developers had underestimated. And the best part? Every step of this victory had been legal. No threats, no violence, no chaos, just smart, calculated moves. They had created the opportunity themselves, and I had seized it. The tables had turned completely. And now, I wasn't just protecting my land. I was profiting from their mistake, proving that patience, knowledge, and strategy are worth more than any tower they could ever build. The day I finally walked into Tower 7's lobby, the place that had once symbolized their arrogance, I felt a strange mix of triumph and calm. The marble floors gleamed, sunlight bounced off the glass walls, and employees rushed past me, completely unaware of the storm that had quietly taken shape beneath their feet. And there, in the corner office overlooking the city, sat the HOA president, the same man who had dismissed me, laughed at me, and assumed I'd never fight back. I didn't storm in. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. I simply handed him the latest statements, signed rent agreements, cleared payments, and documentation showing that, legally, every square foot they occupied belonged to me. His jaw tightened. His hands fidgeted with the pen on his desk. And in that moment, all the years of underestimation, all the smirks, all the arrogance, they collapsed silently in the weight of evidence. "I hope you understand," I said calmly. "Every dollar coming from these towers is now legally mine. You built on my land. You took my property. And now you pay for it. Fairly. Legally. And there's nothing you can do about it." He swallowed hard. No excuses. No arguments. Just the quiet acknowledgement of reality. I realized then that the sweetest victory wasn't just the money. It wasn't the leverage. It was the shift in power. The quiet yet undeniable truth that someone they had dismissed as ordinary had outplayed them. Lawfully, patiently, strategically. The emotional payoff hit me on the drive home. I passed Tower 9, where tenants were still setting up offices, and I smiled, not with malice, but with relief. Relief that justice, in its own way, had been served. Relief that knowledge, patience, and strategy had triumphed over arrogance and entitlement, and relief that I hadn't let anger or revenge cloud my actions. Every move had been calculated, legal, and precise. Every step had turned their overconfidence into my advantage. By the time I parked at home, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the fields that had started it all. I looked out over my land, the skyscrapers looming in the distance, and realized something profound. I had turned what felt like an impossible situation into a story of empowerment. The HOA thought they had power. They thought they could bulldoze my life. But in trying to control me, they had created their own undoing. And in that moment, I made a vow, not for revenge, not for payback, but for life moving forward. I would continue to protect my land, my rights, and my family's legacy. I would remain vigilant, because the towers reminded me every day, power can shift in unexpected ways, and the underestimated always have an advantage if they're smart enough to see it. I smiled, finally at peace, They had built their empire on my land. They had assumed I would never act. And yet, here I was, legally in control, strategically victorious, and quietly, undeniably triumphant. Weeks have passed since that meeting in Tower 7, and life has settled into a new rhythm. But nothing feels ordinary anymore. Every time I drive past the skyscrapers, I no longer feel anger or disbelief. I feel a quiet satisfaction, a sense of control, and yes, a little pride. Because what once seemed like an impossible situation, a powerful HOA, arrogant developers, and 10 skyscrapers planted on my land has transformed into proof that strategy, patience, and knowledge can outmaneuver even the most confident adversaries. I've kept the interactions polite, professional, almost cordial. The HOA still exists, still holds meetings, still tries to maintain appearances. But the power dynamic has shifted entirely. They now operate with the awareness that every inch of property they use belongs to me, and every dollar generated on it is partly mine. Their arrogance, their assumption that they were untouchable, it's gone. In its place is respect, caution, and, most importantly, acknowledgement of my rights. For me, this isn't just a story about property or skyscrapers. It's a story about persistence, about learning the rules better than anyone else, about waiting, observing, and striking at the right moment. Not out of anger, but out of principle. It's about taking control of what's yours, without breaking the law, and proving that even a single person can stand up to a system that seems designed to silence them. And here's the kicker. The part that makes the story feel almost cinematic, almost unreal. The towers they built in arrogance are now funding their own lesson. Every lease, every rent check, every tenant occupying my land is part of a system they didn't even know they created. They thought they were clever. They thought I was insignificant. And yet, here I am, legally, strategically, and undeniably in control. I tell this story not just to share a victory, but to remind anyone watching the underestimated have power. Knowledge is leverage. Patience is strength. And sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one rewriting the rules. So if you ever feel powerless, if you've been dismissed, ignored, or overridden, remember this. The game isn't over. The next move is always yours, and sometimes, the most unexpected victories are the sweetest of all. And for anyone in the HOA, the developers, or anyone tempted to bulldoze what isn't theirs, consider this a warning. Every tower, every building, every dollar could be part of someone else's plan. Just ask me, because in the end, they built on my land, and now they're paying for it.